Chapter 9, Part 2, which should really be Part 1, but we've kind of done them in reverse this time, just to keep things interesting. This is the first half of the chapter, and it talks about who can sue in a contract, and it talks about who can assign or delegate the contract to another third party, and then it talks about third-party beneficiaries. And we wrap up with the discharge of a contract and the degrees of performance for the discharge of a contract. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty of it, I guess. Privity of contract is a phrase that implies or says that only the parties who've entered into the contract have rights within that contract, which means only the parties within the contract can sue for a breach of contract. And that's fairly obvious and seems like common sense to everybody. But things can get somewhat complex if the rules aren't laid out fairly straightforward. To review just a bit before we get into this, Chapter 7, we looked at contracts, we looked at agreement and consideration for what is needed to have a contract, and then we looked at types of contracts. In Chapter 8, we again looked at the conditions to have a contract, which was capacity, legal capacity, and legality of the contract. If a contract is the task that is within that contract is illegal, then the contract isn't void. And finally, we looked at enforcement. So that kind of brings us up to date. And then in Part 1, we looked at let me go down. We looked at this, contract discharge. We looked at how we can complete a contract. We looked at the performance by the breach, by operation of law, by failure of condition, and by agreement. So now we're going to fill in the blanks or the gaps with who can sue and how you can transfer ownership or responsibility of a contract to someone else. So, and of course, this is a law, so there are always exceptions to privity, and those exceptions involve giving another party rights to that contract, your rights. And there's two ways of doing that. One is called assignment, which transfers a right to a third party, and you then have the assignor and the assignee, and that's unconditional. If I am assigning somebody the rights to that contract, I'm giving up all my responsibility. I no longer have rights. I can't go back and sue. I wash my hands of the whole matter. Banks frequently do this type of assignment for mortgages. Assignment of a personal nature are generally not allowed unless it's under agreement, such as if I wrote up a contract to do somebody's taxes for the next 5 years, and then I found out that I was being called out of the country, and I assigned that to another accountant. I can't do that unless I have the agreement of the other party. That's something of a rather personal nature, I guess, because well, you could get much more personal, a masseuse or somebody to paint a painting, anything that involves possibly you were selected to do that for a personal reason. There are exceptions about the assignments. You cannot prevent the right to receive funds. Such as I had a contract, and instead of having them pay me, I said, no, pay my daughter instead, and that was written in. You can't stop that. You can assign the payment of that contract. You can't assign it, can't stop the assignment if it's the rights for real estate or negotiable instruments, and the right to receive damages from a breach of contract. I could assign those, and there's nobody that could stop that happening, because that's actually outside of the contract in many ways. And usually it's not required that you tell the assignee, such as banks usually don't tell you, they don't have to, but they do, that something has been assigned. They should. It's not written in law that should happen, though. So then the other type, okay, we've got the assignment here. Now we have delegation. And this is sort of like where you would subcontract it. Let's say somebody contracted with me and I'm to take them a load of dirt in my truck. Well, I don't want to get my truck dirty, so I hire the farmer down the road to use his manure truck to haul the dirt. I can assign that. It's not of personal nature. So I can delegate that instead of assigning it. I would get paid for it, and then I would pay him what we had agreed upon in the delegation. I don't relieve myself of the responsibility for that contract. I'm still responsible for it. I've just delegated part of the duties out. And I must express that I'm going to delegate it to whoever I have the contract with. The exceptions are obviously personal in nature, expertise, talents, similar as I talked about with my accounting contract. Or if it's written into the contract that you can't do that, then that would prohibit any type of delegation. So question 1 is, I've forgotten, I'm going to have to look. Question 1 is, privity in contracts means only the parties involved in the contract can sue for breach of contract or have rights in the contract. And that is a true or false. So now we need to look at third-party beneficiaries. And the intent at the time to benefit a third party, and those are called intended beneficiaries. And intended beneficiaries can sue if they are designated. You have a creditor beneficiary, such as, I think the book had one, I thought was a really good one, talked about a condo, and the condo obviously had managers, and the managers have a contract with all of the condo owners about damages. And one apartment above this other apartment caused damages, water damages, and the apartment with the damages sued the apartment above. And it came out that, yes, they could sue them because they were affiliated, or in a roundabout way, could go through the condo association. So that's like a creditor beneficiary. Then you have a donee beneficiary, such as in life insurance, and sometimes there are conditions put on that. You have to have, rights may have to be vested or earned. There has to be consent from the beneficiary. There's conditions of vesting, must be satisfied. So there are conditions usually with that. And then there's something called the incidental beneficiary, which means unintended benefits come from a contract that you're not actually involved in, such as somebody contracts to have a concert. I'm not involved in the contract, but I am enjoying the benefits from the contract. In the scheme of all of that, I have no right to sue because of that contract. So that's called an incidental beneficiary. And it looks like it's time for question 2. And again, I don't have a clue what that is right now. It's a true false. There is no difference between assignment and delegation in contracts. True or false. And then finally, to wrap this up, we're going to look at the degree of performance for discharge of a contract or conditions of a performance. Usually contracts are expressed in absolute promises, so they must be performed, or a breach of contract occurs. And some of those conditions are called condition precedent, which means it's an absolute condition and it must be performed, or the contract is going to be breached. There's a condition subsequent, which is a condition that terminates an absolute condition, i.e., if I sign a contract, an employment contract with a CPA firm, if my CPA license lapses, I'm in breach of contract because I have to have a CPA license to continue working with them. That's subsequent. And then there's concurrent conditions. Duty to perform is contingent on the other party performing their duties also. So it's sort of a give and take. If you do your part, I do my part, and our contract is still valid. And then we come down to this, and I find this really just a good graph, something, or a good graphic to understand that there are 5 parts, or 5 ways that you can discharge a contract: by performance, by breach, by operation of law, failure of condition, and by agreement. And we talked about those in part 1, so you can review in part 1. And now we have question 3. And question 3, guess what? What are the 5 ways to discharge a contract? Select all that apply.